Greetings, A-Push Nation. It's Mr. Majewski with my Vice President, Guinness. And we are about to cover Jeffersonian Democracy for you folks. So hopefully you have the notes out in front of you. Hopefully you are ready to go. And we're going to go through these things pretty quickly today. So if you need to stop it or pause it for any reason, feel free to do so, because I'm going to try to go quickly so the video doesn't go that long. Again, there is some information that is not necessarily in the notes that you're going to need to write in as we go. So you should have those notes out in front of you, and you should be prepared to be taking notes as we go along. Isn't that right, my big boy? Okay, you don't have a lot to say. Anyways, Vice President, I'm going to put you there in charge of the Senate. Let me get you your seat available, and let's get underway. Alright folks, so we are covering Jeffersonian Democracy today. That's 1801 to 1809, and you better know by this point that it's named after, right, Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. So of course we start with our theme. This is the theme of the overall notes, and it's really kind of straightforward. Jefferson's pragmatic, effective policies. Effective policies are pretty obvious. Pragmatic means that even though he was a Democratic Republican, even though that he had been very strongly principled, that he really believed in his interpretation of the Constitution, strict construction, and his limited government philosophy, that when he becomes president, he's really going to adopt a more middle-of-the-road, a more understanding set of policies. And so he's going to govern in a lot of ways like Washington and Adams did, where he puts the interests of the country over his own personal political philosophies. And by doing this, he's going to strengthen the principles of the two-party Republican government, the two-party system. Even though this revolution, when he was elected, right, this term for he taking power, because remember, he represents the masses, even though it caused a lot of political strife, even though it caused a lot of political tension between Federalists and Republicans, the way that he governs really causes the nation to become more unified as a result. Boy, we sure could maybe use this in today's day and age, huh? So anyways, next slide, Thomas Jefferson, there he is, right? He's going to be a two-termer. He is our first Democratic-Republican president, remember. He takes over after two Federalists, Washington, who was a Federalist kind of in policy only, not in name, and then John Adams, the one-term Federalist president. Looking at our presidential rankings here, next slide, where does Thomas Jefferson rank? He ranks 7th now. It's an interesting number for me. I think a lot of that maybe is more of like a lifetime achievement sort of ranking, because his presidency probably doesn't match up there with some of those lofty names ahead of him. For that matter, where do we see John Adams? I don't think we looked. 17th is where he is, right smack dab, kind of in that middle row. So history does not remember Adams as fondly. Jefferson, obviously, top tenor. All right, so let's kind of see why the public believes he earns that reputation. Next slide. Jeffersonian democracy is what we call it, folks. That is rule on behalf of the people. Now, hey, the people are not running the government. The lower classes and the middle class are not running the government. It's wealthy folks. It's privileged folks, but they run it on behalf of the people. They represent the interests of the masses more so than the Federalists did. So Jefferson takes over after the election of 1800, right? And as we know, that is called a revolution of 1800. Now, that's a revolution in name only, right? Again, there was some concern. There might be some problems. The Federalists wouldn't step down. They would pull out the army. Maybe have the army physically prevent Jeffersonians from taking over. That doesn't happen. The Revolution of 1800 is really just more of a term we use to describe this transition of power from one party to another. It's the first one in American history. More importantly, it's a transition from one party that technically represented the interests of the upper classes the interests of the federal government to one that represents the interests of the lower classes, the masses more. And so it's a real difference in how people think the government is going to be run. It's going to be more sensitive to the needs of middle and lower class Americans, a lot of folks think. A lot of folks worried that this might result in a great deal more mobocracy or support for mobocracy. All of these fears, to be honest with you, are really going to be unfounded. What we are going to see is more people involved in government than ever before. We're going to have more and more folks that are able to vote. We're going to get rid of some of those property requirements, which makes it what we mean to say here is that it's a more democratic style, right? And so Jeffersonian democracy, again, it's really just ruling on behalf of more Americans than just maybe a smaller group of wealthier elites educated. Anyways, he knows when he takes over, this is divided nation. Hey, this campaign of 1800 was divisive, all right? There was a lot of negative talk. There was a lot of that sort of stuff going on. And so he gives a very famous speech to kind of calm down people's concerns, their fears. It's during his inauguration. And it's the famous line from it is, hey, we're all Republicans, we are all Federalists. What he's trying to say there is, we're all Americans here. And even though we have some political differences, ultimately our uniqueness as a country is that we all share very similar ideas deep down inside. We're all based on the same ideas. Yeah, we might disagree as to how to solve this particular problem, but ultimately we all are the same. We're united. We all believe in kind of the same democratic principles, Republican ideals. We just differ over how to specifically address certain issues and our interpretation of the Constitution. Again, a couple of images that are very famous here before we get going that kind of show to you how much strife and disagreement there was in this country. So, this is a Federalist cartoon, and it depicts Jefferson. He's about to burn the U.S. Constitution as the American eagle snatches it out of his hands, right? And, of course, this is produced by Federalists, right? And what we're talking about here is, this is funny, they view themselves as like protectors of this, of the American ideal. The American eagle is supposed to be a representative of them. It's snatching the Constitution out of Jefferson's hands as he's about to throw it into this essentially like a burning, I don't know, bin. Like he's going to set it on fire, like he's going to destroy it. So Federalists were very concerned that Jefferson was going to trample on the powers of the Constitution, that he was going to take them away, that he was going to send us into anarchy or mobocracy, that he was too inspired by revolution and by the French Revolution. You all right over there, Guinea? That we were going to lose a lot of the things that the Federalists claimed that they had started. All right? So let me get the Vice President here established. He seems to be a little upset with my characterization of Jefferson. It's not me, it's the Federalist, Guinea. All right, I didn't say it, they did. Anyways. Here we have another criticism of Jefferson. This shows you again how divisive politics were. This is called the philosophic cock. A cock, of course, being a rooster. Here you see Jefferson depicted as a rooster, which was a symbol of the French Revolution, by the way. So again, trying to tie him to that bloody, ruthless French Revolution that he supported. Remember, he was a big supporter of France, particularly revolutionary France. And who do they have in the background? They have Sally Hemings. That's his slave mistress. I don't know if you know this or not. Jefferson had a relationship with one of his slaves. They had many children together. People knew about it, and so they're trying to basically disrespect him, I guess you could say. They're trying to destroy his presidency by declaring that he's promiscuous, that he's engaged in sexual relations with his slaves, that he can't be trusted or relied upon. So these are smear tactics, right? Bringing his personal life in here to try to maybe destroy or undermine his political will as well. All right? Let's go to the next slide. Here we go, the electoral map of 1800. Now, we already looked at this, right? But again, remember, the big difference here was New York, right? Remember, New York had voted for Adams in the previous election. This time around, it goes Jefferson. Those are the votes that he needs to win this election. There's a number of interesting facts here, right? I mean, look at Virginia, 21 electoral votes, Massachusetts, 16. Those are the large populous states, right? New York's a big one with 12, so it tells you kind of the demographics of the country. But you see new states that are formed, right? Kentucky, Tennessee, more heavily involved in this election than ever before. There's Vermont, right, as well. Anyways, we already saw that map. There's not much to report there. We already saw this as well. Remember, this is the history of the major parties. And so we are now seeing the Jeffersonians take over. And we're starting to see the process of the Federalist Party kind of falling apart. Next slide. Interestingly enough, remember, he's trying to send a unifying message. He's trying to unify a divided country, a country that's very nervous about his presidency. What is he going to do? Is he going to take away all the Federalist policies? Is he going to create this environment, this setup where the masses are going to be in charge and it's going to be kind of chaos and we're going to lose all of our order? We're going to go back to like a Haitian Rebellion sort of situation in this country. Anyways, what does he do? Well, he behaves like a moderate, like a pragmatist. And again, why did he change? Because he believes he needs to put the interests of the country ahead of his own political views and his political party's views. He believes that if he upset the balance too much, that this country was in a delicate position and a lot of the progress that had been achieved would be lost. So he kept almost all of the government servants that the Federalists had had. He keeps them in power, all right? So instead of firing all those Federalist workers, he's going to keep them all. He keeps all of Hamilton's financial plan intact except for the excise tax on whiskey. Remember, that was a campaign promise of his. I'm going to get rid of that excise tax on whiskey because it was unfair to the whiskey distillers. So he keeps the bank after strongly opposing it, if you remember, right? He keeps funding at par. He maintains the assumption of debts, right? He maintains the tariff, even though, if you recall, he had bitterly opposed it because he thought it favored the North over the South. So again, recognizing there was a need for these policies and a need for our financial system to be bringing in revenue, he maintains those policies. Next up, he reverses some Federalist policies, but nothing major here. He does pardon the men who had been convicted under the Sedition Act. All right, so he's going to pardon those 10, which means he forgives them of their crime. They get out of jail. And that was 10 newspaper editors. Now, hey, that's not a shocker. They were Republican newspaper editors, if you remember, right, that had supported him and opposed the Federalists. So he lets them off. He creates a new naturalization law, or I should say he and Congress do, because Congress switches over to the Democratic Republicans as well during this election. They go back to the 5-year requirement for citizenship. Again, that shouldn't surprise us. Why? Most new immigrants into the country, remember, were Democratic Republican. So obviously they want to go back to the old system where these folks are going to be allowed to vote earlier, because that's a large number of potential voters and supporters of the Democratic Republican Party that are going to be involved in elections that are going to help them to maintain their political control. Again, he does repeal the excise tax on whiskey. That was a campaign promise he had made. Remember, he had thought the government was a little too harsh, a little too abusive against those whiskey rebels who felt that they were being unfairly taxed. He does reduce the national debt. First off, he balances the budget, which says, hey, we're going to reduce our spending so that we only spend as much as we make in tariff money and in taxes. That's called balancing the budget, so that you're not going into debt further and further each year. He also reduced the national debt from what it had been. He reduced it significantly, in fact. If I'm not mistaken, the national debt went down from like $13 million to about $5 million during his presidency. He actually worked closely with his Secretary of the Treasury, a guy named Albert Gallatin. Interestingly enough, Gallatin was a Frenchman, so he worked closely with a Frenchman who he had met while in France, who he liked his Treasury ideas. He liked this this reduction of the debt idea, and so he and Gallatin worked closely in order to reduce it. How did he do that? Well, he reduced the size of the military. All right, he cut the army size in particular. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. One, he saw no reason for there to be a peacetime military. Secondly, right? Remember, Democratic Republicans believed that a peacetime military was just going to be sitting around and eventually would be used by government against actually the people to abuse the rights of the people. So, hey, let's reduce the size of that military, Jefferson says. We'll also cut costs and reduce our national debt. Please also remember, Jefferson believed that the national debt was a burden. And so, these are things that he wants to see taking place, all right? He replaced many Federalist officers as well with Democratic Republicans. Look, the military, in particular the Army, was seen as a stronghold of the Federalist Party. It was one of the last areas in our government that the Federalist Party tended to dominate. And so he wants to get rid of a lot of those Federalist officers because he sees them as a group that would actively work against him as president, maybe not listen to his orders or disobey his orders. Or enforce his orders, and so he wants to replace them with as many possible Republicans as he can. Give me a moment here. Moving along here, what else does Jefferson do to reverse or change some of these Federalist policies? Well, he ends the graduated property tax. Now, there had been a property tax that had been imposed by Federalists in 1798. Again, this was a graduated property tax. So what that means is the more land that you owned, the higher the tax that you paid. That's what graduated means. The more of something you have, the higher percentage of tax you paid on it. This had been imposed by the Federalists. Now think about why he would do this. Remember, he is a plantation owner. He and other Southern farmers and plantation owners owned a lot of land. Federalists or Northerners, industrialists, didn't own as much land. And so this was something that he felt kind of unfairly targeted Southerners, and in particular agriculturalists, plantation owners. And so he's going to get rid of that. Number 6, he emphasized states' rights. Look, he's a big believer in that 10th Amendment, remember, that says all power not specifically granted to the federal government in the Constitution belongs to the states. He's going to try to grant states more control over affairs or issues that are not specifically addressed in the Constitution. That, again, does fit with his views. Lastly, he really encourages the development of agriculture. An agrarian nation is an agricultural nation. He's a Southerner. He's a plantation owner. He believes this country was founded on agriculture as it was. And he believes that agriculture is our future. It's what we're going to continue to be in the future as well. So he wants to encourage an agrarian nation, agriculture first over industry. He's kind of wrong here, right? Because he completely kind of misreads the Industrial Revolution. But to him, he envisioned a future where from, as far as the eye could see, there would be, from coast to coast, farms and farmland that the people would be working. All right? Anyways, let's get to some issues here. Okay, so the 12th Amendment. So when Jefferson takes over, one of the first things that happens is that the 12th Amendment is passed. That said that electors had to now specifically state who the candidate for president and vice president was. What we mean here is from now on, presidents are going to actually run with vice presidents like they had in 1800. And on the ballot, the electors had to write my choice for president is this and my choice for vice president is this. There's a reason for that, because in 1800, the first time that the presidents actually ran with a vice presidential running mate, Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, his vice president, actually tied in the election of 1800. Let me explain why this happens. All right. So Jefferson wins the election. And so when the electors, the Electoral College, writes down who their winners are officially, they put Jefferson and they put Aaron Burr. Well, the problem was that when the votes were counted, technically, since both names were on the paper, Jefferson and Aaron Burr had the same number of votes. Now, everybody knew Jefferson was supposed to be the president and Aaron Burr was supposed to be the vice president. But according to the rule of the law, they technically tied for the presidency because, well, both of those names were on each of their ballots. And so, in the event of a tie, or in the event where nobody wins the electoral majority, then the House of Representatives chooses the president. Now, hey, they knew Jefferson was the president and had won the election, so they went ahead and declared Jefferson the winner. Hamilton, in fact, threw his vote behind Jefferson because he hated Aaron Burr so much, if you remember, because of some of these feuds they had previously when Burr was still technically a Federalist. So ultimately, Jefferson's declared the winner, but this leads to confusion, what would happen in the future. So they passed the 12th Amendment that says, hey, from now on, electors, make sure on your ballot you actually write who the president is, who's the vice president is, so that we don't have ties between the president and his vice president in future elections like we technically did this one around. Now, let's get to John Marshall and judicial review. So, the Federalists are worried. They've lost the presidency. They've lost Congress. They've got one branch of the government left that they can control. They control most of the judgeships because, well, up until this point, it's been Federalists who appointed the judges, and most of them supported the Federalist Party. Well, they're worried. They're about to lose those two branches of government. They worry now that Jefferson and Congress are Democratic-Republican, that they're going to eventually lose the judicial branch as well. So before that can happen, when Adams is still in power, one of his last things that he does is he has Congress pass something called the Judiciary Act of 1801, and what it did was created a bunch of new federal judge positions. Their idea is they're going to stack the judicial branch with Federalist judges. Remember, judges serve for life, so therefore they would still be able to control at least one branch of government, no matter what happened with the executive and the legislative branch in the future. And so what they do is they create a bunch of new judge positions. And Adams, and more importantly, his Secretary of State, John Marshall, proceed to try to send these commissions out, to get them out to the judges to say, hey, guess what? You've been approved. You're a new federal judge, and this is the area where you're going to work. They did this literally up until the last couple of days of Adams' presidency. This is how last minute this decision was made with the Judiciary Act. So it's totally a political motivated thing. They're doing this to try to maintain part of the government. Because they know they're about to lose the other branches. So it's not like we needed these new judges or anything like that. It's really just in a way to try to maintain their political control. Anyways, they're handing these commissions out, these things that say, hey, you're a judge, congratulations. They're getting them mailed, they're getting them hand-delivered. But they're not going to be able to get all of them delivered in time before Adams' presidency runs out, all right? So what happens is John Marshall, the outgoing Secretary of State, leaves them on the desk of the incoming Secretary of State, the guy that's going to serve under Jefferson. That is James Madison. So again, Marshall basically leaves them on the desk and says, hey, will you continue to deliver these? These are judge commissions that we didn't get out in time. Now, Republicans are kind of outraged by all this. They know what this is. This is just a political move by their opposing party to try to maintain control over one of those branches of government. And so when Jefferson and Madison come in and take over the White House, there's these judging commissions on Madison's desk, and they decide, hey, don't deliver them. All right, whatever. Those guys didn't get them delivered in time. We don't support this, so we're not going to deliver those judge commissions. We don't believe they're necessary. Next slide. That's going to take us to, let's go back to the last slide really quickly. So one of those dudes who didn't get his commission was named William Marbury. Marbury finds out later on he was supposed to get a judge job, and he never got the commission. And so what he's going to do is he's going to sue the government, and then specifically the Secretary of State, James Madison, who he believes was supposed to have delivered that commission to him. All right, that's going to set things up for what is by many considered to be the most important case in American history. Because here's what's interesting about it. John Marshall, the Secretary of State, was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by, lo and behold, John Adams, right before Adams loses the White House, right before Adams steps down and is taken over by Jefferson. Now, Marshall was a hardcore Federalist. He believed absolutely in the power of the federal government over the states. He had long maintained Federalist principles. He's going to be on the Supreme Court for like the next 30 years, and he's like a thorn in the side of Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans because he's constantly going to be making decisions that he thought backed up Federalist ideas like the power of the national government over the states. Remember, Republicans are states' rights guys, and yet this guy that's running the Supreme Court who serves for life, right, is a hardcore nationalist and a hardcore Federalist. And so he sees this case, Marbury versus Madison, as his opportunity to pump up the role of the Supreme Court and to pump up and preserve the Federalist Party, even though they've lost the White House and Congress. So, most important court case in U.S. history. Why is it important? Well, Marbury sues Madison, says, I never got my commission, and that's wrong. I should have gotten it. And what John Marshall rules, all right, is that, hey, it's kind of a complicated one here, right? So let me summarize. Marshall says, hey, Marbury, you're right. You probably should have gotten that commission, but here's the problem. This Judiciary Act of 1801 was based on the previous Judiciary Act of 1789. And what Marshall rules is, hey, the president or the executive branch isn't allowed to really select or determine when new judge positions are created. So what happened is Adams and the Judiciary Act of 1801 referred back to the previous Judiciary Act, 1789, that had established the court system, and said, hey, the president gets the right to determine when new judgeships are created. What Marshall rules is, hey, only Congress has the right to determine when new judgeships are created. And so the Judiciary Act of 1789 is declared unconstitutional by Marshall's court, and therefore the Judiciary Act of 1801 is unconstitutional, since that had been based on the Judiciary Act of 1789. What is significant about all of this, these details, is that Marshall rules for the first time ever that the Supreme Court can overturn a law that had been passed by Congress. This is something called judicial review. This is what gives the Supreme Court its power, and this is the first time it's ever invoked or used by the court. It says, hey, before a law can become truly official, we have the right to review it and strike it down if we think it goes against the wording of the Constitution. So this massively increases the importance of the Supreme Court. It suddenly makes them the equal of the other two branches of government. Up to this point, it wasn't that way. In fact, if you were appointed to the Supreme Court, it was almost seen as like judges turned it down a lot of the time because they thought it was kind of a powerless thing, that it could be bullied or controlled by the other two branches. So what he's saying here is, hey, the court is significant, it is important, and it can have the same power to strike down laws that have been created by Congress and approved by the president as well. So Marbury, sorry, he says, you probably deserve that commission, but the laws that gave you the commission were unconstitutional according to Marshall, so therefore, even though you're right, you probably should have gotten that judge position. That judge position should have never existed in the first place, because the law that helped create it is unconstitutional. All right, so the significance of Marbury versus Madison is that it establishes this principle of judicial review. For the first time now, the Supreme Court has the ability to review. If you want to contrast it with Kentucky and Virginia, remember Kentucky and Virginia, written by Jefferson and Madison, said, hey, the states can overturn federal laws, right? They have the power to do so if enough of them agree to do so. Madison and judicial review under Marshall says, no way, only the Supreme Court can do that. The states don't have the power. It massively increases the significance of the Supreme Court. It's going to become a much larger, more important thing now after this decision. And let's remember, Marshall did this kind of intentionally, because he and Adams and other Federalists were desperate to maintain their control over one branch, and they wanted to give the judicial branch more power, more strength to resist Democratic-Republican ideals. All right? Almost immediately after this decision is made, Jefferson actually is outraged. He and Democratic Republicans wanted to get rid of Marshall, but they couldn't, because the only reason you can impeach a judge is if he does something wrong, like breaks a law. Well, Marshall hadn't. And so what they did is they targeted another judge. They tried to impeach him, which means remove him, because they were so angry about this judicial review, because they thought it was a political move again, a maneuver to take away power from the president and Congress just because the Federalists had lost those things. And so they tried to impeach one of Marshall's allies on the court, a judge that agreed with him named Samuel Chase. Why? Well, there were rumors that Chase maybe was drinking, maybe drinking on the job, and was incompetent to serve because of that. They tried to remove him. It failed in Congress. Jefferson was upset by that, but that's an important thing. It's significant, because by not being able to impeach Samuel Chase, the federal government, the judicial branch, their independence is preserved. If they had been able to impeach Chase, from that point forward, the judicial branch would have been weak because judges would have had to depend and answer to the other two branches. Otherwise, they could have easily been removed by the president or Congress. So by not being able to impeach Chase, it's a really good thing for our democracy, for our country. It preserved the sanctity, the independence of the judicial branch. Now, other issues. Well, remember, Jefferson had reduced the size of the military. Why? Because he saw it as a burden, a debt burden. Remember, Jeffersonians believed debt was a bad thing, that future generations were going to have to pay off. And also remember, he thought the military, especially the Army, were bastions, were strongholds of the Federalist Party that he wanted to reduce in size and importance. Well, remember, the problem here is that the Barbary pirates are attacking us. Remember, those Barbary states in North Africa, they are raiding American ships. And so ultimately, Jefferson has to reverse course. He has to actually build up the Navy in order to try to stop these attacks. He thinks we're finally in a position to stop them. He's getting criticized for not doing anything about it. And so he increases the size of the Navy. We build more ships. We build small little ships called gunboats. We don't build the big daddies like you would expect in the British Navy. So we still have a smaller Navy, but it is larger after Jefferson agrees to build it up in an effort to try to stop these attacks by the Barbary pirates. And this is especially important because one of these Barbary states, Tripoli, which would be kind of like Libya today, they declare war on the United States in 1801. And so we must respond to them. Thomas Jefferson sends the U.S. Navy under a guy named Stephen Decatur over to Tripoli. We fight a series of battles against them, naval battles. Eventually we are victorious. Thanks to our new Navy, we're able to withstand and eventually defeat these pirates. Takes a few years, but we finally forced Tripoli to sign a peace treaty in 1805. This is a big success for Decatur. It's a success for Jefferson. We finally are responding to some of these foreign threats. All right, there's the famous image, right, of Stephen Decatur boarding a gunboat in Tripoli as we are trying to finally respond to these overseas threats. We finally feel like we're in a position to better be able to stop them. Now, we attacked other Barbary states as well, leaders and ships, all the way up till 1815. So we go back and forth for, again, about 15 more years. Fighting against these countries. That's how long it takes us because we are still not a very powerful military. But eventually, we're able to sign treaties with each of these and get these attacks, this harassment to stop by 1815. Again, while Jefferson starts it, Madison's going to continue. It's viewed as a victory for the American people and for Jefferson's presidency. Now, another major issue here is the Louisiana Purchase. What happens here with the Louisiana Purchase? Well, in a secret treaty between France and Spain, Spain gave France Louisiana back in 1800. So now it's back in the hands of the French. And so James Monroe and Robert Livingston are sent by Jefferson over to Paris to try to negotiate a deal for us to get a hold of New Orleans. Now, Jefferson's instructions are very simple. Hey, get New Orleans in all lands, just a little slip of land to the east of New Orleans as well. We don't want to see New Orleans port closed to us in the future. Jefferson actually was willing to maybe, conceivably, even if the French said no, maybe form an alliance with Britain to try to pressure Napoleon and the French to stop. Well, Jefferson tells them, hey, buy New Orleans and a little slip of land to the east for $15 million. We'll offer as much as $15 million. That's what they're authorized to spend. While those dudes are over there, Napoleon comes back with a ridiculous deal. All right, he basically says, hey, I'll sell you all of Louisiana territory, including New Orleans, for $25 million, just $10 million more than they were going to pay for one city. Why? Well, Napoleon is obsessed with the war in Europe at the time. He's focusing on the war in Europe. He doesn't want to be distracted by France's overseas possessions. He wants to win the war in Europe. He's in the midst of a dogfight with the British and their allies at this point, and he's fighting for survival. He doesn't want any more distractions. He especially didn't want distractions because of the Haitian Rebellion. In 1791, there was a rebellion in the little Caribbean country of Haiti that was owned by France. It was a slave revolt. It was led by a guy named Toussaint L'Ouverture. Napoleon had to send over some of his very best soldiers to try to put this rebellion down. And what happened is they all came down with malaria, and many of them died. And so he felt like these losses in overseas, in places like Haiti, were causing him to lose the war in Europe. And so because of that, he said, hey, I want to get rid of my North American empires. I want to get rid of these overseas empires, because his focus, his fixation was on Europe. And he wants to take the money the U.S. is going to pay for him for Louisiana, and he wants to use it to build up his empire in Europe that he is currently trying to establish. So anyways, he offered, that's what it was, $15 million for the Louisiana territory. I believe we had been, I think, now that I think about it, Jefferson had said $10 million was the amount he was willing to spend. Napoleon says 15 for Louisiana, all of it. Those dudes over in France, Livingston and Monroe, are basically like, dang, we were only supposed to spend 10. But look at this deal. It's an offer we can't refuse. So they go ahead and accept. They bring it back to Jefferson. Jefferson's in a tough spot here, all right, because he's a strict constructionist. So he doesn't really believe that the Constitution gives him the power to acquire this land. He thought Congress had to do it. And Congress had to be the ones to agree to this expansion. But he drops his resistance because he thinks this Louisiana is such a great deal. It's going to increase the size of the country basically by twice as much. And so even though he's not sure it's constitutional for him to have arranged this agreement without Congress's support, he urges Congress to approve the deal anyways. So again, this is an example of him going against his own political views in an effort to try to do what he thinks is best for the country. Now, interestingly enough, the Federalists opposed the Louisiana Purchase. They became strict constructionists and claimed Jefferson didn't have the power to arrange this deal. They didn't like the cost of it, but more importantly, they were worried that all of this land would be settled and turned into states out west. Those would probably be farming states. And what that meant was they worried that their political power was going to be reduced even further. So they basically, again, opposed the Louisiana Purchase for political reasons, not really for any sort of real reason. All right. Anyways, Louisiana is going to be approved by the Senate. Look at this massive amount of land that we acquire for just $15 million. If I'm not mistaken, it was something like 4 cents an acre, which is a ridiculous deal. What an incredible deal. Now, Spain still possesses this area here, right? This area here is unclaimed by anybody at the time. But look at what Louisiana does. Look at the land that we have now compared to the original size of the United States. Literally, we've doubled in property. Originally, Jefferson wanted New Orleans and this strip right here for $10 million. We end up getting those two things plus all of this for $15. What an incredible deal. Arguably our most important expansion or land acquisition in our history. Not arguably, it was. All right. Significant, like I just said, it's the most important land purchase. It doubles the size of the U.S. It gives us the Mississippi River Valley and many other river valleys that your notes talked about, that the chapter guides talked about. It guaranteed us access to the entire Mississippi River. It's now our possession entirely, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. It's going to pave the way for incredible westward expansion. Unfortunately, it also paves the way for the demise of many natives who are now going to be caught in the middle of the U.S. Westward expansion with nowhere to go. All right, and again, it really ends European expansion in North America. It reduces those threats to us on our western frontier. Remember, we no longer have Spanish threats down here. We had made that Pinckney's Treaty to deny that. Now we don't have to worry about French threats or British threats up here any longer as much. So again, what an incredible deal. Now, other reasons why it's important: we avoid war with France, which may have broken out had France refused our request. And hey, it boosts American nationalism. For one of the first times ever, the United States is going to feel fired up. We're going to feel good about this. It's going to boost American nationalism and support. We feel like we're finally becoming slowly the equal, maybe, of some of these other countries. These European rivals, that they're starting to take us more seriously, and for this incredible amount of patriotism and pride that develops afterwards, because this is seen universally by the American public as a good thing. Now, we explore the Louisiana Territory. We basically bought this without knowing what we had gotten, sight unseen. And so Jefferson orders two explorers, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, they're known as Lewis and Clark collectively, to go and explore this territory. They're gone for like the next 2.5 years. They go all the way across the Louisiana Territory. They're going to go all the way into this disputed area, the unclaimed area, to the Pacific coast, and then they're going to go back again. All right, so it takes years for them to do this. Now, they establish an Oregon Trail, or a trail westward, that's going to be followed by thousands of settlers that come after them. They establish relationships with Native Americans. They actually befriend, and one of them develops a relationship with Sacagawea. It's Sakakawea in some history books. She's actually an interpreter and a guide who helps them to navigate across this area, because there's many, many, many different native tribes. Some are hostile to the Americans, and she kind of is an in-between, a go-between. She's a negotiator, and she helps them to find routes, to find paths. She helps them to deal with hostile tribes. And so she really helps this expedition to survive. It's only like 30 or 40 men total, so they could have easily been wiped out. She's really, I think, kind of the savior or the hero of all of this. Again, eventually develops a relationship, I want to say with Lewis, with one of the two. She later on, I believe, becomes his wife. It also bolsters the claim to this area, because we're the first ones to really explore it, because we're going to establish this trail, which is going to cause people to move into the area. Later on, when we want Oregon and Washington, we're going to win the rights to that, thanks to the efforts of these guys who had kind of claimed it for us at first. All right, one last thing. They provide us detailed maps and research of the plants and animal species, which is one of the things that Jefferson wanted. He wanted to know, hey, what Indians are there, what plants, what animals, what did we just buy, basically. Basically, it'd be like you going and buying, like, I don't know, a storage locker filled with stuff without really knowing what the heck was in it. Alrighty? What a deal. Massive, huge, so profitable. The U.S. lucked out in getting it from France. They showed up at the right time when Napoleon really was willing to get rid of it. Now, a couple of other things you need to be aware of from Jefferson's early presidency. Well, the Federalists are struggling. They are weak. They've lost the White House. They've lost Congress. They are a dying party. They're worried with the Louisiana Purchase that their days are numbered. And so, interestingly enough, what happens here is Federalists actually got together in New England, which was the last state, last region, if you remember, where they had any strength. And they actually plotted secession. They wanted to break away from the rest of the country and create their own Federalist country. So what happens is these prominent Federalists secretly made plans to secede, to break away, to revolt from the rest of the country. They called it the Essex Punto. They made the agreement in a place called Essex, in a town called Essex. A junto is basically overthrowing your government with force. They knew they needed some sort of prominent Federalist to lead their country if it was going to succeed, if they were going to rebel. And so they went to Hamilton, and Hamilton was kind of like, no, but he didn't say anything about it, all right, to anybody else. He knew that they were planning the secession. He didn't want to be the president of this new country if it was founded, if they did indeed secede, but he didn't alert the government or anybody else that there was this treasonous plot going on. So then they went to Aaron Burr next, and these Federalists, and they said, Burr, would you consider doing it? And he said no, and what he did was he went and he made it public what they were doing, that they were planning secession, they were planning a revolution, and he knew that they had asked Hamilton to take over first, and so he indicted Hamilton as well. He basically disrespected Hamilton and announced, hey, you know, Hamilton knew about this and he never did anything about it. He's kind of just as much of a traitor as these guys that are actively planning to revolt against us. So the junto fell apart, the secession plan fell apart. When people found out about it, when it became public, it never happened. These guys were, you know, they lost their reputations, those who were planning it. and the government was able to prevent it from taking place. But what actually a side thing that happens because of this is Hamilton got bitter, he got frustrated, he got angry with Burr for exposing him, for basically saying he was a part of this plot. And so he challenged Burr to a duel. If I'm not mistaken, it was something like 6 duels that Hamilton was in over his life. Burr and Hamilton got into a duel. Ultimately what happens, a duel is something where you both, take 10 steps away from one another, you have a gun in your hand, and you each get one shot at each other. Hamilton fired and missed Burr. Burr turned around and shot Hamilton and killed him. So ultimately, Alexander Hamilton dies at the hands of Aaron Burr. Burr kind of went over the deep end, I will tell you that, because of all of this, the plot and he was involved in, and he lost favor with Jefferson because they had very different political views. Jefferson chose not to name him as the vice president in 1804. He went with Madison instead. Burr kind of freaked out, ended up being involved a little bit in this Essex Junto before exposing it. Then Burr is on the run. After killing Hamilton, he goes down to the southwestern states, Mississippi, Louisiana, and he actually tried to encourage them to secede from the government, make him the president, and maybe ally with Spain. Ultimately, the governor of Louisiana, James Wilkinson, makes this public as well, exposes Burr, and eventually Burr is arrested and later removed from the country. All right. Anyways, craziness. Aaron Burr was our vice president, quickly loses favor or popularity with Jefferson, and then is involved in not one but 2 different controversies involving the Federalist Party. All right. Oh, by the way, he also kills Hamilton in between. Anyways, last topics we want to talk about today are the Napoleonic Wars and the role that Jefferson plays in them. So despite him wanting to avoid international conflict, Jefferson was forced to deal with foreign policy problems as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, hey, it's one thing to fight against the Barbary States. It's a whole other thing to be taking on these big boys, right? Because as the Napoleonic Wars continue, they start up again in the 1800s, and by 1805, Britain controlled the seas, and Napoleon and the French control almost all of the European continent. Well, hey, Britain starts to seize American ships that are headed for Europe. Anytime they knew an American ship was headed for Europe, since France controls almost all of it, they assumed, rightfully so, that the Americans who are neutral are trading with the French. And so they start seizing American ships. Well, they actually told the Americans, yeah, you got to trade with us in England first. So that's what Americans did. They started traveling to England first to follow these British rules. And then they would move along to Europe. Well, hey, in 1806, Napoleon issues the Berlin Decree. He establishes what's called the Continental System. He says, hey, we will not trade, no European port will trade with any ship, with any vessel that trades with the English first, or that travels to England first. And he basically says, hey, it's a continental-wide rule, where if this port or this country is under French control, then we will close all of our ports, everything that we control to you, if you trade with the English first or you go to England. So now the Americans are stuck. They're like, little rubber duckies caught in the waves here, right? Because all they want to do is trade with England and France, who are fighting against each other. But Britain's seizing their ships. France says, hey, if you go and trade with England first, because that's what Americans were being forced to do, we'll close all of Europe off to trade with you as well. Eventually what happens is the British respond in 1806 and 1807 with orders in council, which say, hey, we're going to raid neutral ships, including American ships, on the open seas if we believe you're headed for France. So again, now the Americans are stuck between a rock and a hard place. If they travel to Europe to try to trade with the French, the English are going to stop them, raid them, and seize their cargo. If they go to England first and then try to trade with the French, then the French will close off their ports or even seize their cargo once they make it into the European harbor. And then, in the Milan Decree of 1807, Napoleon announces that they will, that they will basically do the same thing as the British, that if any neutral ship, any neutral vessel can be targeted by the French if if there's a belief that they might be trading with the English. So again, going back here, the Berlin Decree closes off Europe to American trade if Americans trade at all with the English. So when Americans move to Europe now to try to trade, the Orders in Council are passed by Britain, which says, hey, we'll raid neutral ships, we'll seize your cargo if we believe you're traveling to France or to Europe. And then Napoleon responds back to that with the Milan Decree that says, hey, we'll essentially do the same thing if we think you're trading with Britain. All right, so Americans are really cut off from the trade. They cannot avoid being harassed. Americans have other problems. The British are still using impressment against American ships. 6,000 Americans were impressed between 1808 and 1811. Many of these guys were forced to serve in the British military, and some of them were killed, right? So forced service for a country that they don't belong to, and then some of them die in battle as well. Then, as if matters couldn't get worse, the United States Chesapeake is traveling along the coastline of the United States in 1807. And a British warship, the Leopard, rolls up next to it and basically demands to board the ship. Based on the Orders in Council, they believe the Chesapeake is smuggling goods to the French. And so the Leopard demands that the Chesapeake allow their crew to board and search the ship. When the Chesapeake refuses, the Leopard opens fire. 3 American sailors are killed, 18 are wounded. The American public is outraged by this. They're outraged by the Orders in Council, they're outraged by impressment, and now they're outraged that a neutral American ship has been fired on by the British. Jefferson begins military preparations. All right, so we're actively on the verge now of war with England because of the harassment, because of the impressment, because of the Chesapeake Leopard affair, which was a major, caused a little bit of anti-British hysteria to pop up, just like the XYZ affair had caused anti-French hysteria to pop up in the past. So Jefferson's response to try to avoid war is this. It's the Embargo Act of 1807. What he says is, hey, we're not going to trade anymore with anybody overseas. We're going to stop exporting goods to everybody. That doesn't make a lot of sense when you stop and think about it. That's going to kill your economy, and he knows that. If you intentionally cut off all trade with the rest of the world. His idea was, hey, France and Britain need our products, and we're going to not trade with them or anybody else so they can see just how important our trade, our shipping is to them. And when they see how much they need our products, then they're going to be forced to respect us in the future. They're going to be forced to stop these orders and councils and this harassment of us. So he basically says, yeah, we're going to suffer from this, but ultimately the other sides are going to suffer from us more because they need our trade more than they think that they do. All right. Loose construction here. I'm going to kind of skip over for the time being because it's not significant. But folks, the impact of this is disastrous. All right. It's a death blow to the U.S. It sinks us into a depression. It's called the Panic of 1807. We basically build these products, but we intentionally do not ship them overseas. So we have these huge stockpiles of products that just build up on our docks and in our warehouses that we never tried to sell because of this embargo. So the federal government refuses to legally allow people to sell their goods overseas, which means we have no overseas trade during this era, which is a disaster to our economy and sinks us into a depression, the Panic of 1807. Now, remember, who made the products? New England, right? The manufactured products. Who does the shipping? New England and the middle of the colony, or the mid-Atlantic states. So ultimately, New England is the most affected by this, right? Remember, that's also where the Federalists are the most located, and that's also where the greatest amount of criticism and smuggling is going to occur in violation of this law. This is a great chart here. What it's showing you is, look at our exports, right? Now, imports are what we bring into the country, all right, when we were still importing a lot of goods. Look at the exports, right? The blue line here, all right? Follow them. Okay, they go up, they go down. Look at, they're going up here, and then boom. Do you see that drop off right there, right? From $10 million down to, $20 million in exports. We lose almost $100 million in trade in about a year, in a little less than a year, because of the Embargo Act. What a disaster. All right. Now we're going to get rid of it in 1808, and you'll see that our trade starts to go up again. But the point is, when this happens, this is going to sink us into a depression. This was clearly Jefferson's worst decision as president. He totally overestimated how important our trade was with Europe and France. He totally thought that they would suffer more than they did. They could get their products from other places. We destroyed our economy by trying to show them, hey, we're a more important economy and you need us more than you think that you do. All right, bad miscalculation by Jefferson. I would argue his worst decision as president. On top of that, hey, we have inspectors, we have customs agents that are enforcing these laws, that are refusing these merchants, these shippers, these producers from selling their goods overseas. And so what did some of these guys do? Oh, they tried to smuggle, they tried to resist, they tried to get around these laws. This is a cartoon showing the American tax collector trying to stop the trader, right? The tax collector is supposed to be the turtle, trying to stop the trader, right, from selling his goods as they're trying to smuggle them onto a ship to sell with England. You see the English flag right there. All right. So anyways, all the Embargo Act did was drop Jefferson's popularity some, especially in New England, which was already struggling and which now has its economy ruined by the Embargo Act. It's like a self-inflicted law that really, really hurt our economy terribly. Anyways, the law was repealed when Madison took over, and it was replaced with something called the Non-Intercourse Act. Now, the only difference here is instead of cutting off trade with everybody, the Non-Intercourse Act said that we'll just stop trade between France and England. We won't trade with those two countries. And whichever country agrees to stop the harassment of, we'll trade with them, but not with the other guy. All right? So ultimately, Napoleon is going to be the one that says, all right, I'll stop the harassment. And so the Americans are going to open up trade with France down the road. All right? So anyways, instead of embargoing our trade with everybody, which makes no sense at all, right? Now we're just going to embargo our trade with the two countries who are responsible for the harassment, and whichever one stopped first, France, we would agree to open trade up with them and not trade with the other side. Now, reasons for the failure. One, smuggling. All right? We still sell our goods. But the big reasons for the failure, we still sell our goods, people are still smuggling goods, but most importantly, why does the embargo fail? It fails because our trade was not as significant as Jefferson thought it would be. The British and the French were not as dependent on us for trade goods as we anticipated. More importantly, our economy was dependent on trade with Britain and France, and so when we intentionally decided to no longer export goods, that meant that we lost $100 million in revenue, right? And that means factories have to cut jobs, have to fire people, factories close down, shippers and merchants have to shut down. We had these stockpiles of goods that are just stocking up on our docks, right, which is decreasing the value of all of our products. And so we kind of by our own decision, right, our own actions, we slunk ourselves into a depression. Now, the one positive of the Embargo Act, because we were no longer getting goods, right, from overseas as much, we had to start the process of making products ourselves. And so we produced our products for the first time, and we start to see the first factories emerge as a result because Americans still wanted products. They just couldn't get them as freely overseas like they could before. And so a lot of folks believe the one silver lining of the Embargo Act is that the Industrial Revolution starts in the United States during this period because of this lack of products from other countries that we depended on. So I guess that's the one positive, the one silver lining is, hey, we do start to see industrialization start in this country because Americans still wanted these goods, even if they could no longer get them overseas. Now, hey, Britain eventually is damaged by the effects of the Embargo Act as well. It just took the effect on us much more significantly, much more quickly, and that's why we fall into that panic, that depression. Now, Jefferson's legacy, 2 terms as president. Expansion. We expand mightily. We do start to create that agrarian empire with all of those farming states that we knew. or that we create as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. We do create a government that more caters to the needs of the people. We reduce a lot of those aristocratic traditions. We're going to drop property requirements so more people are allowed to vote. Because of Jefferson's popularity, and he was popular even as a result of the Embargo Act. When he steps down, he's very popular. He was seen as kind of a champion of the people. The Federalists are going to be destroyed by 1816, and most importantly, even with the disastrous Embargo Act, he keeps us out of war with Britain and France, which would have destroyed us as a country, just like it would if Washington or Adams had gotten us into a conflict as well. Memory device, Big Late Ham, right? Big Late Ham, there it all is for you, the major parts of Jefferson's presidency. This is Mr. M signing out with the Vice President, right, who has fallen asleep on me and is out. Hopefully you didn't fall asleep. If you did, I'm sorry. Then again, Guinness isn't being tested on this. You are. All right, so signing out for you, Mr. M. War of 1812, I'll be coming back at you with here soon.